Good evening, everybody. I will call the meeting to order. We're going to begin with a couple of public meetings on the agenda, and then we'll go into the business section with one business item. I will read a public meeting introduction notice. Personal information collected as a result of this public hearing and on the forms provided at the back of the room is collected under the authority of the Planning Act and will be used to assist in making a decision on this matter. All names, addresses, opinions, and comments may be collected and may form part of the minutes, which will be available to the public. Questions regarding this collection should be forwarded to the Director of Planning and Development. The purpose of public meetings is to present planning applications in a public forum as required by the Planning Act. Following presentations by the applicant, committee members will be afforded an opportunity to ask questions for clarification or further information. The meeting will then be open to the public for comments and questions. Interested persons are requested to give their name and address for recording in the minutes. There's also a sign-up sheet for interested members of the public at the back of the room. No decisions are made at public meetings concerning applications unless otherwise noted. The public meeting is held to gather public opinion. An exception to this rule is combined reports, which consolidates the public meeting and comprehensive reports. These applications are deemed by staff as straightforward and routine. The business practice has been in place for a number of years and is received by the applicant as efficient customer service and effective use of committee time. Please note that staff use discretion in determining if an application can be a combined public meeting comprehensive report to expedite the approval process. Public meeting reports are provided to inform the public of all relevant information. Information gathered is then referred back to planning and development staff for the preparation of a comprehensive report and recommendation to planning committee. This means that after the meeting tonight, staff will be considering the comments made by the public in their further review of the applications. When this review is completed, a report will be prepared making a recommendation for action to this committee. The recommendation is typically to approve with conditions or to deny. This committee then makes a recommendation on the applications to City Council. City Council has the final say on the applications from the city's perspective. Following council decision, notice will be circulated in accordance with the Planning Act. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the Council of the Corporation of the City of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but the person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. And our first business tonight is a public meeting requesting zoning bylaw amendment, and it's on page 3 of our agenda, and I will recognize the proponent, planner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, everyone. My name is Yuko Leclerc. I'm a land use planner with FO10 Consultants, and I'm here presenting an application for zoning bylaw amendment at 1020 Lancaster Drive, which is the Lancaster Drive Public School, and 1044 Lancaster Drive, which is the Mother Teresa Catholic Elementary School. Now, I'm presenting these applications on behalf of the Limestone District School Board and the Algonquin and Lakeshore Catholic District School Board, and they're both represented here this evening and will be joining me after my presentation to help answer questions, and we'll also be joined by a representative from AECOM, a project manager, at that time as well. So I'm going to dive right in. Our subject sites are located in the city's west end. They're on the south side of Lancaster Drive. Just across the road from Holy Cross Secondary School. They're just north of Garden Walk Park, and they're more or less embedded within a residential neighborhood. Our subject sites are right next to each other. Lancaster Drive is public schools on the east, and then Mother Teresa's on the west. The reason that we're here this evening is because there have been some ongoing traffic issues at the sites and within Lancaster Drive that have kind of evolved over time. And the two school boards have gotten together and hired a traffic engineer to root out the problem, find out what exactly is causing it, and to develop a solution. That traffic engineer did surveys of parents at the schools and interviewed staff at the schools and did their own monitoring of the site and identified what is actually causing the traffic challenges in Lancaster Drive and on the schools themselves. The traffic engineer recommended a number of solutions, and in consultation with the city, those solutions were refined, and they recommended some site plan changes. So I will get to those site plan changes, but I want to start with what's the issue here. And the traffic engineer identified that there are kind of overlapping issues, but also unique issues at each site. So I'm going to do my best to use my mouse. Whoops. There we go, to point out certain aspects of the site. So starting with Lancaster Drive, the school has an abundance of parking and staff parking along the west side of the property. And there are two driveway entrances off of Lancaster Drive, but it actually functions as one because there is a one-way flow here for vehicles. They come in at the west entrance and exit at the east entrance. Bus loading and unloading also happens directly in front of the school. Lost my mouse. And there is a small number of parking spaces in front of the school as well. So what happens is buses enter the site and they unload their students, and then parents enter the site as well, and they're all kind of vying for those same limited number of spaces to load and unload. So because of the large number of private vehicles and parents dropping off their children in private vehicles, a lot of parents end up having to drop off their children in the municipal road allowance. So they'll park on the north or south side of Lancaster Drive, and their children will get out of the vehicles and cross the road. And there's no real control of pedestrian traffic or vehicular traffic other than the one-way directional traffic for vehicles on the site. So children are crossing Lancaster Drive all over the place, and they're crossing the driveways internal to the site all over the place. Over at Mother Teresa, there are a separate set of challenges. There is, just on the west side of the school, that driveway is primarily for the daycare, and there is staff parking there. And then on the east side of the school, there's a very limited number of staff parking spaces. And there's also, right along here, right at the kind of northeast side of the building, is the bus loading, and that's where a lot of parents will unload their children as well. Because of the limited number of parking spaces, a lot of teachers are having to park on Lancaster Drive. And we're having the same issue with buses, limited number of spaces for buses and parents to unload on the site. So parents are unloading on Lancaster Drive. They're unloading on the north side for the most part because teachers are using up the south side of the drive. And kids are having to cross, again, willy-nilly. There's no real control of where the kids are crossing the road. It's a fairly narrow road, and with vehicles parked on both sides, there's very limited visibility. So there's a lot of traffic concerns and a lot of potential for traffic conflicts. The traffic engineer identified all this. I mean, part of the root cause of all this is that these schools were designed at a time when children were expected to walk to school or use the buses, but the transportation patterns have changed. A lot more children are being dropped off at school in private vehicles, and the schools were just not designed for that particular approach to student transportation. So the ultimate recommended change in site plan is the one that's presented right here. So it's this color-coded plan is the one that the traffic engineer feels is in consultation with the city's traffic department. This will present a solution. It won't address all of the problems, but it'll address the vast majority of them from a traffic perspective, both for vehicles and pedestrians. And there's three kind of key components to this plan and the way that it's going to function. There's the assignment of parking space functions on the site. There's the controls on vehicle circulation, and then the controls on pedestrian circulation. So in terms of the assignment of parking spaces, the orange spaces that you're seeing on the site, those are staff parking spaces primarily, longer-term parking spaces. The yellow spaces that are kind of a greeny yellow, those are short-term parking spaces, so primarily for parents that are getting out of the vehicle and going into the schools with their children, whether they're dropping off a note or picking something up or whatever. The parents are leaving their vehicles and they're leaving sight of their vehicle. The pink, purple spaces, those are drop-off spaces. So parents are generally, if they're leaving their vehicle, it's to help the child get out of the car or van or whatever, and that's about it. Otherwise, the vehicles are are going to be in those spaces for a very short amount of time, and they'll be parking, letting people out and leaving, and there will be a constant flow of traffic in those spaces during peak traffic periods. And then those bright green spaces are the bus parking spaces. So you'll note one of the big changes on the site is that Lancaster Drive will now only have one driveway access to Lancaster. Lancaster Drive Public School will only have one access to the road, so that western entrance is going to be closed. So traffic will come in at Mother Teresa and will drive east through the site and exit at Lancaster Drive. The way that vehicles are going to work on the site and vehicle circulation is going to work, in terms of the daycare at Mother Teresa, there won't be a lot of change. In terms of the general of Mother Teresa itself, the school aspect, vehicles would be entering here at this entrance and using the drop-offs here, and then circling back around and heading east across the site, following the main flow of traffic. Users of Lancaster Drive, whether it's the daycare or the school, will be coming in at Mother Teresa and will be driving straight through and then using the drop-off spaces or the short-term parking spaces to let off people and students at that school. You'll note there is a green space here, and I said that all the bus parking is going to be moving into the road allowance. That one is intended for special needs buses and accessible buses, so it won't be the standard buses. The majority of buses will be unloading on the south side of Lancaster Drive, so there won't be that conflict internal to the site of buses and cars trying to vie for those same spaces. The buses will be parking on Lancaster Drive and letting their kids off there. So that ties into the whole idea of pedestrian circulation being controlled. Excuse me. So right now, there is no real control for pedestrians on the site. And the plan as designed here would establish fencing on the north side of the road, on the north side of the school. So basically from the driveway in Mother Teresa to this main north-south pathway would be a chain link fence, kind of screened a little bit with some landscaping. And then on the Lancaster Drive Public School side, it would be the same thing. So a fence would extend from that pathway all the way to the driveway. So pedestrians and students that are getting off at the buses will have no choice, generally speaking, but to use the north-south corridor. And they'll be directed that way by teachers and by signage and by the programming that's associated with this plan. There are a few other locations where there are pedestrian crossings of the driveways on the site. Those are primarily just for ease of access to the school, and they're not in the main way of circulation, but there has to be one crossing, at least, of the driveway. And the idea is to have just the one crossing and really control pedestrian movement through the site that way. This program is going to be accompanied by a lot of education. So the idea is that the schools are both on board with this, and they'll be communicating this plan to parents so that parents are aware that this is happening and that it's not something that just happens on the site one day and they arrive and the plan's completely changed. There will be an education program happening with this. There will also be some signage on the site to make it quite clear what the intention is of the different parking spaces and the way that traffic is supposed to function on the site. And then, of course, the schools will be enforcing it. Staff, there are staff that come out during peak periods, especially in the morning and in the afternoon, and they'll be monitoring the uptake and the use of the parking spaces and the driving aisles and so on as it's intended, and they'll be enforcing that with parents. I'll very quickly touch on the specific changes that are proposed to each site. So Lancaster Drive, there's a certain number of visitor parking spaces in the front, 19 in total. The reason I mention that is because it does apply to the zoning. And then there's accessible parking spaces are proposed to be shifted to the west side of the building. At Mother Teresa, right now there's a huge shortage of staff parking, so this proposal would double the amount of parking on the site for staff, both on the west side of the school and on the east side. I'll note very quickly that there are some parking spaces proposed on the north side of the driving aisle over here. Generally, the idea is to minimize traffic conflicts. Those parking spaces are going to be designed and intended just for staff use only. Staff would be arriving before peak period and leaving after peak period in the afternoon. So the idea being that when people are pulling into and leaving those spaces, they're doing so outside of the main traffic times to avoid any conflicts with with parents that are dropping off their children. So the reason that we're here this evening and asking to rezone the site is because in order for these changes to be made to the properties, to the schools have to go through a site plan control amendment process. They have to amend their agreement, the agreements that they have with the city, and establish a kind of a reciprocal situation where they're both working together. In order for the city to approve the site plan control agreements and the amendments, the plans have to comply with zoning. And these revised plans, there are a few aspects of them that just don't quite meet some of the technical requirements of the zoning bylaw, in particular regarding front yard visitor parking and the angle of intersection of one of the driveways. So that one is very much a technical one. And then the front yard parking, again, is largely technical and is necessary in order to make the sites work as intended. So when we do a zoning bylaw amendment, we of course have to review the proposed application against the official plan. In this case, the lands are designated residential, which allows elementary schools. There are some policies in the official plan that deal with front yard parking, and they're very specific, and there's a number of tests in the official plan for when front yard parking is appropriate. We review the proposed visitor parking spaces and the long-term parking spaces at Mother Teresa against those policies and feel that they conform to the official plan. So in our opinion, this proposal conforms to the OP. In terms of the zoning, the sites are both subject to a site-specific open space zone in the Kingston Township zoning bylaw, which allows elementary schools, and it also allows front yard parking for visitors only and with a 25-foot setback from the front yard. So when I mentioned the technicality of this, what we're asking to do at the Lancaster Drive Public School site is we're asking to continue to allow visitor front yard parking, but reduce that setback from 25 feet to 1 foot. Which is, because of the way the site works, that's kind of the narrowest point, and that's at the kind of the eastern part of the site. We're also asking to reduce the minimum angle of intersection of the driveway to 55 degrees. The zoning bylaw requires 60, and this is for the eastern driveway on the site. Again, very much a technical matter, and the review of that particular request is, because of the way the site works, because it's one way, there's not a lot of concern with the way that intersection is going to function. At Mother Teresa, we're asking to reduce the setback for visitor spaces to 5.8 meters, and then we're asking to allow non-visitor spaces with a reduced setback. So that's the gist of what we're asking for from the zoning bylaw amendment perspective. This amendment is required in order for the site plan changes to happen and in order for the schools to implement these improvements to the traffic circulation and the traffic design of the two sites. It conforms to the official plan and to the provincial policy statement. And with that, I welcome any questions or comments from the committee, and I'll welcome the representatives from the school boards to join me at the front. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll turn to staff for any information.
Mr. Chair, a public notice for the evening was given in accordance to the Planning Act, so a sign was posted on the property 20 days in advance. Notices were sent by mail to 124 property owners with 120 meters of the property, and an ad was placed in the Kingston Whig Standard. We do have some public comments received on the application. We have received them a written record so far. Those public comments and any heard this evening will be included in the review in the comprehensive report.
Very much. We'll now turn to the committee. Are there any questions or concerns? Yes, Councillor Osanek.
Thank you, Mr. Through you. I do have some questions. Thanks very much for the presentation. And I want to thank the school board for coming up with these designs, for running the traffic study, and the outcome of the traffic study. What we see here this morning or tonight is definitely better than what we have now, because it's trying to address the parking that's on the north side of Lancaster Drive. That's really dangerous. And I also want to thank the school boards for staggering the starting times of both Mother Teresa and Lancaster Drive, because it would be worse, if it was still the same time that the classes start. But now the two schools start about half an hour difference in the morning, and I'm sure that's been a big help, because I think that's been for the past 2 years or so. So I did submit some questions. They're in no particular order, but I do want to hear the answers, because those are the concerns that I've heard going into tonight. So one of them is, we'll start with some easy ones. If you want to go up to that schematic of the concept plan with the colors of the overall site, for those 2 accessible parking spots, yeah, that one's good. That's right there on the west side of Lancaster Public School. For any people going into those accessible spots, which entrance door is it in? Because I've heard the concern that they might be too far away to actually be considered accessible spots if the intent is for them to come in through the front doors off of Lancaster Drive.
So that's correct. Currently, the accessible entrance at the school is the front entrance at Lancaster Drive. So with no changes whatsoever to the school or to the plan, those spaces, the users of those spaces would be circuiting around and entering at that location. There is an entrance right here, right beside those spaces, it's accessible in that it's at grade, but it's not a controlled entrance from the school's perspective. They don't have a buzzer and a camera there to buzz people in. So there is an opportunity to improve that entrance and turn it into one of those types of entrances, which is controlled, so that it could function as an accessible space, and users of those 2 spaces wouldn't have to go all the way around to the front of the school. And if I may, just before, and through you, Mr. Chair, the city has an opportunity through the site plan control amendment process to require those types of changes inside the school.
Okay, thank you. Another I heard was, since now all the traffic of both schools will be through the one-way driveway going right past the front of Lancaster Public School going out, when Mother Teresa starts at 9 in the morning, but Lancaster has already, started because they start closer to 8:30. Are the front windows of Lancaster Public School, are those classrooms? And does the school board have, or the principals have a concern that all the traffic going through when parents are dropping off the kids to Mother Teresa, is that going to be too disruptive to the classrooms that could be at the front?
Certainly. Through you, Mr. Chair, there are classrooms, particularly on the east side of the entrance, that face the front of the school and face onto Lancaster Drive. Now, those classrooms have blinds, and there are currently activities on the site that can be distracting to students, such as lawn cutting the grass or works happening on the site. And the visibility of the driveway on the school, as well as Lancaster Drive, is actually not that different. Those classes are quite close to both. So it really becomes a teacher management issue in that situation, where the teachers, if they find that their students are being distracted, it's their responsibility to mitigate that distraction, possibly closing the blinds or something like that. But there is a way of dealing with that that the schools have in place.
Okay, thank you, through your chair. For the buses, when the buses are dropping off the kids on the laybys on Lancaster Drive, and then they're funneling in through that pedestrian crossing there, what's the supervision going to be of the kids? Because the concern is that now you have all the parents driving on the one-way driveway, because they won't really be dropping the kids off on Lancaster Drive anymore. So what is the supervision of the kids crossing over that one-way driveway? How can we make sure that the parents aren't going to accidentally hit any of the kids coming off the buses and going across?
Now, that is, of course, one of the major, Mr. Chair, for these changes. The schools currently, when buses arrive, teachers will go out, and they'll have some teachers on bus duty and staff to monitor and escort students. And that would be an important aspect of this, is that teachers from Mother Teresa and teachers from Lancaster Drive would be monitoring, would have to help shepherd students across that main crossing. But there will be signage as well. This whole plan is dependent on informing and educating parents as well as children about how the site's going to function. So there's intended to be a heightened level of awareness here, that parents are aware that this is going to be a crossing location, and to watch for children at that time of day. But there will also be staff to monitor and to help direct traffic.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, can I ask one more question? Okay, great. Thanks. 2 more questions I think I have. So another question is, for the yellow short-term parking on the one-way driveway, if that could possibly be eliminated and maybe put towards where the orange longer-term parking is along the side of Lancaster, only because there's the concern that it's going to be still a lot of commotion on the one-way driveway, and now it's going to be more narrow than what Lancaster Drive used to be. So since in the traffic survey, we see that the majority of parents are actually, like when they come in to drop off their children, they're actually parking and running inside the school with their children. They're not just dropping them off and doing the kiss and ride, they're actually parking the car and coming in. That yellow area will be really busy if that's where the parents are supposed to, be parking as they walk their child in. And so it's still going to be a lot of commotion, the odds of a child being hit are still going to be there, because as cars are going down that one-way driveway, they're going to have to be looking right and left as they try to get into a parking spot to do the kiss and ride. And now it's going to be even more narrow than what Lancaster Drive is.
Through you, Mr. Chair, the intent is in those spaces is, as you say, that for short-term parking. The intention, I guess, is that users of those spaces will be using the spaces a little bit longer. They won't just be dropping their kids off and walking into the front entrance. So those pink spaces would be more appropriate for that if parents are just walking their children to the front entrance. If they're going into the school and they're using those spaces for a little bit longer, then they would be required to use those yellow spaces. The intention of this design and in not having a lot of short-term parking spaces along the side is to keep traffic kind of moving and reducing areas of intersection within the site. So by having that additional flow along the west side of Lancaster Drive, there are some challenges that would be imposed there, as well as more crossings of pedestrian locations. So that's generally in conflict with the overall vision for the site. But this site, the plan for this is going to be iterative. So the way that it's going to work is the school board would like to implement this going right away and monitor it over the next few years and just see how it functions, if there's any challenges that are introduced as a result of this layout, and if the spaces are not being used as intended. So if that's the case, if some spaces are not being used as intended, then the school board will revisit the design and intention of those spaces. But generally speaking, those spaces are intended to be used for a little bit longer, short-term parking, but in the sense that the parents will be leaving their vehicles for a period of time. They won't just be walking to the school and letting their kids in. So I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the intention there.
Thank you. If I could just provide a comment then, when the communication goes out to the parents from the school board or from the principals, if they could really encourage the parents that with this new design to, just drop off the kids, not so much now park and then still bring them in, but this is now safer, it's now off of Lancaster Drive, try to go to the pink spots and let the kids off on the inside there so they're not on that one-way road at all, and say goodbye to them and pull out. Maybe they'll be more prone to doing that now since this is safer and taking them right off of Lancaster Drive. And the last comment, and again, I know that it's in the questions that I already submitted, but for the comprehensive report, when it comes back, if Public Works could really look at plowing the catwalks. This is supposed to be meant to be a pedestrian school, and I think if the catwalks off of Limestone and Irvin Court and also off of Woodside Drive, if they could be plowed out in the winter time, then parents would actually drop their kids off, and through those catwalks to use Garden Walk Park to get to the back of the school rather than going to the front of the school all the time during the winter that they're doing now because there's snow and ice in those catwalks and the catwalks are not being plowed out. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for that time.
Thank you. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, and you, Mr. Chair. And I think it's a great idea. I really like the proposal. I just wanted to add that when you're monitoring it, I think that's great that you keep an open mind and work with it and see how it evolves. I think it's hard for us to look at a drawing and say that's going to work because you don't know how it'll all unfold as you move forward. Can you go back to that picture that we were looking at with the colors? Yeah. So the premise would be the yellow where you drop off, and you may sit there for a while with your car or park your car for a short term. Would the people get off and walk between the green and yellow? That would be a path walk, I'm assuming? The white area between the green and the
Here?
yellow? No, up by the drive, by Lancaster Drive. Right there, yeah,
Right here?
right, and along the other way. So if they park for the short term, then they could walk through the path walk and they won't cut across the traffic.
There
That's
will
the
be,
assumption, like that would be, you know,
through you, Mr. Chair, there will be a fence here. So people that get off at these yellow spaces would not have that opportunity. They would not be able to go into the municipal road allowance and kind of circle back. They would have to cross the driveway.
they would have to cross the
They would
driveway.
have to, yeah. There's just not enough width there to accommodate a walkway on the north side of the fence and then another one on this side of the fence.
Oh, okay, all right. Well, that's interesting. Okay, well, I guess you'll have to figure it out once it all evolves. But I just wanted to say one thing. When I lived in Denver, Colorado, a lot of the schools were newer, and this system seemed to work very well with a drop-off. It was very efficient. You take your kids, drop them off in the pink section, and it was quick, efficient, and you were in and out very quickly. Thank you.
Thank you. And if you could take the chair, just very quickly. Thank
Chairman,
you.
recognize you.
A couple of things. I want to applaud both the school boards for working collaboratively to find what looks like a good, functional solution to a problem. I do want to say that probably exists at a lot more of our schools. I know that that's a common complaint. Probably every one of us has a district school from one of the boards that has issues with parking and the competition between vehicular parking and bus parking. And I hope that this is a sign of some more remedies that will come up in the future. But I just want to thank you for working collaboratively on this issue. So, thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yeah, no, through you, Mr. So, echo Councillor Turner's concerns. But the fence kind of bothers me, but I would certainly leave it to the better thinkers here. But I guess if we're here to look at it, and my only suggestion that if the fence bothers me because it kind of might create some safety issues as well. So maybe my only suggestion is to really outline where the kids may walk. Make that clear. We do that with bike lanes and everything else. Make it really clear early on through training and everything where they may go. And then I'm sure you can do it anyways because you guys are a lot smarter than me. But it looks to me like there's some challenges here with those who want to walk to the front entrance. So. How they're going to do that. But I'll leave that with you. I just want to say it.
Great, thank you. Any further comments? I will now open up the meeting for public comment. There's a microphone at this chair here and one behind me here. So anybody who wishes to speak to the issue may do so. Just identify yourself with your name and your address. Thank you. Go ahead.
Frank Dixon, 495 Alfred, Apartment 2, K7K, 4J4. Thanks to staff for the presentation on this and to the councillors for their questions. I'm also praising the cooperation and the quality of work that's presented. I think it has potential for being a much better solution. So I have got 8 points which I've identified as being important. So that's the first one. It's the second one. Sort of looking at Lancaster Drive, and we're now into November, so we have winter approaching, and we've got winter control issues there as you're snow plowing along Lancaster Drive, and you're looking at channeling the traffic into a smaller space, right, to be more efficient. I think that's the right idea. But you're also going to have maybe some conflict there in terms of if you have a storm and you're going to be maybe needing to move snow and ice out of there. You're not going to have snowbanks on there, as that's taking up space away from what you want to do with the traffic flow. So I think that's a point that needs to be examined in some detail. My next point is we're already into the school year. We're two months in. So is this looking to be discussed some more and then brought in for next year? Is that the plan? Was that would also leave a lot of time in terms of getting people ready for the changes. If you have young children, possibility of accidents are fairly high. Obviously, anyone's losing their life, it's a catastrophic outcome. So I'm worried about that. I wouldn't want to have it come in this year. I think it's already too late. So, okay, so my next point is what I'm wondering about, this goes into, was said also by one of the questions, in terms of the accessible parking for the Lancaster Drive staff. You've got that, the short-term parking for Lancaster Drive visitors, which are the yellow spaces, I believe, and they're quite a distance from the front. I'm wondering if it's possible to relocate those so that they're nearer the front entrance into maybe some of the spaces that aren't identified out there. Like if you were in a wheelchair or you have issues with a walker or whatever. So that'll be my suggestion on that. Okay. Now, if we could go to page 14 of the agenda package, which is a sort of fairly small scale overview from above, on the Lancaster Drive section, looks like there's some portables at the back of the Lancaster Drive site, just sort of north of what looks like a playing field there. And I don't see the interaction of the portables on this slide here. You just don't show them, right? So are those portables still in play, still in use? And if so, how are you going to deal with the interaction of what you're now showing as staff parking with the orange going right across the same section? Okay. Next point is, are there any Kingston Transit routes running on Lancaster Drive? I don't believe there are, but we now have a large number of school children using Kingston Transit, right, for either part or their whole journey to and from school. So, just in terms of fitting everything in there, so the next point is, I'd like to see the numbers of the new parking spaces identified in terms of their details. Like you're saying, you have accessible parking spaces
30
here,
seconds.
short-term parking spaces, and so forth. Some more detail on that. And then my last point is, this is great to see. I would like to see it in the package when I was reading it through before the meeting. We get the full 10 slides into the agenda package so that the average citizen can follow the explanation. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, just for everybody's information, we always, all of the questions get asked, and then staff and the proponent, planner, have an opportunity to respond to those questions. But we gather the questions together first. So I will now recognize the gentleman to my right.
Hi, my name is Mike Marchant. I'm at 1074 Dillingham. I have 3 children, two of which go to the school, and one who will be going to Lancaster starting next year. I'm also here representing as the chair of the parent council for Lancaster, and of course as a concerned citizen of that area and concerned parent. The very first thing I'd like to say is that I'm very happy with all of this, the information, the transparency that we've had, the opportunity to speak with my counselor in regards to these things, to this plan. I do have a few. I do see a few challenges that I would like to bring forward. The very first is that this plan has been put together with both of the school boards. However, I'm not sure to what level and to what degree Holy Cross and the principal at Holy Cross was brought forward. I may be mistaken, but as this is very much pedestrian safety at a point in time in the past, one of the children who has been struck by a vehicle on Lancaster was actually a student from Holy Cross. And when we look across the street at that area there by the sidewalk, there are several trees and blind spots, which I'll come to into another point as well. But I think that the safety of the children on that side, because many of those children do come to pick up their brothers and sisters at either Lancaster or at Mother Teresa. And so there is some cross movement along that area. And as it is now, I don't particularly, and I've spoken to a few of the parents, I don't particularly consider it to be a safe spot, and I think it should be integrated into that plan. The other concern I have is, as a parent who drops his child off, both of my children that are going there now are 6 and 4. So they're not really prepared to start walking to school. So I do drop my children off, and I do see there's quite a volume of traffic there. But that volume of traffic inadvertently, in my opinion, causes Lancaster Drive to be a little bit of a slower area, because you really do have to drive around Lancaster, drive around the schools quite slowly, because there are cars that are parked willy-nilly in some cases to help their kids get out. And of course, during snowy season and when it rains, it's even more of a challenge. Concern that I'd like to bring forward is that in the event that we proceed with this plan, I can see that Lancaster Drive would inadvertently become much more open, and speed would increase for cars that are driving. And if you add that to my last point, it kind of increases safety issues as well. So I think one of the biggest points, one of the biggest concerns that I have is especially after listening to what you had spoken about, I think that also one thing that we need to look at is the genesis of the problem, or the challenges that we're facing. Both schools were designed to be walk-to schools. In the short time I've been chair of the parent council, I've had an opportunity to speak to people about the plan here, and to get more historic information. Originally, from what I gather, and anyone can please correct me if I'm wrong, the school was initially designed to be, in 92, was designed to be for 380 students. As it stands now, we're above that number, and on top of it, we do have 3 portables in the back. I think one of the concerns that a lot of parents have been bringing to me, and this goes on both sides of the school, is that the schools, a large number of the population of the school are not from the catchment area. And if you're not from the catchment area, then you're not getting bussed in, you're getting driven in. And so this creates a lot more traffic. This is a lot where the traffic is. And in fact, I do have here the traffic study from Lancaster, from what was done. I did not bring all 92 pages, because it was quite a lot. It's an excellent read. But as I go through it, there's one specific question that was asked: are you within the walk or bus zone? And I can't tell if this question was asked to students from Lancaster, or if they were asked from students from Mother Teresa, or both, because there's no time period that's written here. But what concerns me is that 25% of the people, or at least a larger percentage of the people, let's say we'll start with 8% of the people had no answer to the question. And 25% of the people were answering questions like, well, they're outside of the bus area, and there's, out of zone, they go to daycare, but they're out of the school zone. They live in Westbrook, they're outside of both. The concern that I have overall is that a large percentage, and I think a lot of our parents have expressed this to me, is that for both schools, there are a large percentage of students who are not from the area. And I see this producing 2 potential problems.
Usually there's a 5-minute limit. I'll give you
Okay,
30
this is my
seconds to
only, I think I
complete,
got,
if you would.
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, I think it's pretty obvious what I see the issue to be is that there are students, and I think that along with this, my recommendation, as I have in the back, is a recommendation is that as we go move forward, is that we have a study done on both schools to find out students and title. This is not in any way for anyone not to be expelled from the school or not allowed to come to the school, but it's very specifically to figure out what the real issue is, and its volume. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will just point out that at this particular meeting, we deal solely with land use planning issues, and how both school boards decide who goes to what school is totally outside the purview of the city.
And I recognize that, Chair. I do recognize that, but I think it's also
thank you.
part of it. It's part of it as well.
Thank you. Is there any other member of the public that would like to speak to the issue? Going, gone. Thank you very much. I will give both our staff and the planner an opportunity to address those concerns. And I will recognize any school board person who wishes to address any of the questions that were asked as well, which is stretching the rules a little bit, but that's okay. Go ahead.
Thank you, and through you, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to do my best to go through the questions in the order that they were asked. The first question had to do with snow plowing and potential conflicts with the, I guess, the bus bays on Lancaster Drive. I think there's going to be some coordination that has to happen between Public Works and the schools to ensure that those are cleared. And I'm not sure what the city's standard practice is in terms of clearing bus bays, so I might throw the rest of that answer to city staff.
Through Chair, the typical clearing bus bays is that's borne by the property owner itself and not operations, but this is a discussion that Public Works and planning staff can have as part of this application.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair, the timing of these changes, so in these site improvements. So it's correct, these changes are not happening this year. Just process-wise, the zoning has to go through, and then the site plan application has to be submitted and go through. So it's likely that these changes will, approvals won't be in place until spring, and then construction would take place over the summer and implementation starting in the fall, so September 2019. I wasn't sure I understood the next question having to do with barrier-free parking. I understood that to be very similar to kind of the initial question, that the location of the barrier-free parking would force traffic or users of those spaces to go around to the school, the main entrance. So there is an opportunity there to convert the closest entrance to an entrance that would be usable by the public and by users of those barrier-free spaces, by converting that to a buzzable entrance. So users would just buzz, and then staff at the school would have an opportunity to see who it is and let them in and direct them to the front office just for security of the school. The interaction between the portables. So, and I'm just going to jump over here. So the site improvements that are proposed are primarily to the northern parts of the sites. So there is no real change proposed to the backs of the sites, but there are portables, and you can see those in the aerial images. And in both cases, the existing pedestrian pathways and connections, the sidewalks on either side of the parking at Lancaster Drive along here, and then at Mother Teresa along here, would provide means for pedestrians to get to, or for students to get to those portables. So once students have kind of cleared that, the main traffic venue, the main traffic avenue, that west to east, they would be internal to the site, and accessing the portables would be no different than accessing the main school. On the matter of Kingston Transit, I'm going to go back to my presentation. So in this aerial image, you can see that there is no public transit along this part of Lancaster Drive, but there is some on, there's Route 15, goes along Lancaster Drive and Woodbine Road, so it does pass in the vicinity of the subject site, but it does not pass in front of the schools. So the number of parking spaces and their functions, I believe we iterate that in our planning report, but if not, we can provide those numbers to staff for them to reflect in the comprehensive report. Number of parking spaces. On the question of providing slides with the agenda package, I think that's a procedural question. I'm not sure how best to answer that. I think if the request was provided, it may be possible, but the agenda packages are released quite a bit in advance, so potentially as part of an addendum on the day of, but that's a procedural question for this committee. Now, moving on to these other questions, the interaction with Holy Cross and their involvement in the design of the sites has not been contemplated at this point in time. And I'm not sure if that's a question that's best answered by the Algonquin District School Board. Would you like to weigh in, Mr. Davies?
Sorry, Brian Davies, Assistant Controller with the Algonquin Lakeshore Catholic School Board. With respect to the Holy Cross question and the traffic going across from Holy Cross into Lancaster and Mother Teresa to access the walking routes, that's something that we certainly as a board will look at and have those discussions with the city in terms of how we might be able to best manage that as we go forward. So that is something we will definitely look at. So.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. So there's a concern about the traffic improvements on the site really speeding up traffic along Lancaster Drive. Lancaster Drive is, there are speed humps on Lancaster Drive currently, and it's a controlled street, so it has a 40 kilometer per hour speed limit. Beyond that, in terms of traffic enforcement in the road allowance, there's the city will monitor. And as part of the zoning amendment, the traffic department has advised that they will be monitoring how these changes will affect Lancaster Drive over the next 2 years. And if any improvements or traffic controls interventions are required, the applicants would be responsible for implementing those. Is there anything you'd like to add, staff?
Sure, Chair. That is a lot tonight, so planning staff, as part of this review, will have further discussions with our traffic department and with the proponents' traffic engineers.
Thank you. And I think, Mr. Chair, you answered that last question about the number of students.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments from the committee before we close this? No? Could you take the chair just? I just had really one question of staff probably, and then possibly a comment. I'm curious about, and I appreciate the reason for being here with the number of changes to the parking plan here. If either school chooses to tweak the plan at a future date, say they decide they need an extra bus spot and they maybe have a couple of extra spots that they can fit in, that won't have to come back for zoning review or site plan review, will it? Is this locking them into the plan as we see it?
Necessarily locking them into the plan as we see it today. The zone provisions are really for the reconfiguration of the drive aisle and allowance for visitor parking closer to the front lot line. After this, there will be a site plan control application for each property, which will really be the more concrete plan, which will lock them into the proposed changes. If they were to, say, amend them in the future to add additional parking spaces, remove additional parking spaces, reconfigure an aisle, that might have to come back before council, because there will be right-of-ways over the property. So if anything needs to be moved in that regard, those might have to be shifted, but otherwise it would be through a site plan control amendment that those would have to be reviewed.
Great, thank you. And I'm assuming there'll be adequate signs, so people parking in short-term parking, there'll be some limit that is spelled out for them. Is that accurate? An accurate assumption?
Mr. Chair, that's correct. There will be a detailed and thorough signage program throughout the site, identifying the roles of the different spaces and traffic and so on.
And just a quick comment to both schools. There is an opportunity, if there's a recurring problem with parking and people ignoring that signage, the city does allow you to deputize somebody on your staff to give out a ticket when it's called for. So that may be a consideration. But don't tell anybody I told you that. So, thank you. Thank you. No further questions? I will accept the return of the chair. Thank you. So we'll close this portion of the public meeting and move on to our next one. Thank you. Our second and final public meeting is the review of fees and charges, Select Planning Act applications, and we, I believe, have a staff person and a consultant that will present this to us. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Laura McCormick. I'm the Deputy Director of Planning for the City of Kingston. We are here today at this public meeting to talk about a review of the Planning Act application fees. So in an attempt to better understand the level of effort that our staff within the planning division put forward, along with, I think we have up to 18 other groups within the city that also contribute to the review of applications under the Planning Act. So legal, for example, and communications and engineering and transportation services. And there's a whole team of people who participate in the review of Planning Act applications. So in an attempt to better understand the level of effort and the costs associated with that review of development application fees, we retain Watson and Associates Economists Limited to complete a cost recovery analysis that just gives us a better understanding of that level of effort and where we're at as it relates to recovering those fees and how we compare to other municipalities from a fee recovery perspective as well as from an application cost perspective. So we wanted to have a public meeting tonight in advance of bringing forward recommendations for the 2019 fee update that we do as a city every year. There are, I think, 5 fees that we're actually looking to increase a little bit beyond the standard 3% increase for the 2019 year and to implement a fee for the pre-application process. So it really is to better cost recover in areas where we felt it was appropriate to increase beyond that standard 3%. So we wanted to have a public meeting tonight to receive any kind of feedback from the public, from members of Planning Committee on our proposed amendments to the fee bylaw and provide you with the rationale through Watson. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Peter Simcisco, and he's going to walk you through the rationale and the methodology they used.
So thank you for the introduction, Laura, and good evening, everyone. Just to sort of echo a few of the introductory comments made by Laura to sort of put things into context. So the planning application fee review was undertaken in an effort to better understand, or to help the city better understand the amount of effort that's involved in processing these different application types, the associated cost, as well as the overall level of cost recovery that's currently provided by the city's fees charged in this regard. And again, further to that, we in detail analyzed the current level of cost recovery by activity type in order to identify potential opportunities to improve that level of cost recovery. The review was undertaken within the legislative context governing the imposition of planning application fees, as well as with regards to the broader market context in which these fees are charged. The full details of the planning application fee review are provided to you in a report that I believe is Exhibit A to the report as part of this meeting. And really this presentation will sort of summarize and provide an overview both of the legislative context within which the review is undertaken, as well as the methodology that we utilize in deriving the full cost of service, the process generally undertaken with staff in developing this, and then finally a discussion of some of the recommendations that are being put forward here today. So in terms of the legislative context, planning fees are governed by Section 69 of the Planning Act. And Section 69 specifies that the anticipated costs and the resultant fees must be cost justified at the application type level, as defined in the city's tariff of fees. And what this requirement would suggest is that while we're not required to necessarily assess the specific costs tied to the processing of any specific application, we do need to differentiate in the costing exercise by application type and to align that with the tariff of fees that the city imposes. And if, in terms of the statutory process requirements with these application fees, the Act does provide for applicants to pay these fees under protest if they have some issues with them, and they can be appealed to the local planning and appeals tribunal, what was formerly the Ontario Municipal Board. The methodology that we employ as part of a costing exercise is an activity-based costing methodology, which I will walk you through in a little bit more detail on the following slides. So the activity-based costing methodology as it pertains to user fees more generally and specifically for planning fees within this context is illustrated on the slide. And so working from the right-hand side to the left, you'll see with the green dots on the right-hand side, we are trying to identify what are these costing categories. So this goes back to the legislative requirements of differentiating applications by type and really putting groupings of activities into buckets, if you will, that have similar amount of processing effort required or that go through a similar steps through the review and process. Moving then to the left, there are direct costs that we're trying to assess against these costing categories. And so firstly, what we are trying to understand is what are the departments that are involved in the processing of these various applications, and more specifically, what are the staff that are involved in the processing of these applications. And then taking the amount of effort that these individuals and departments spend, assigning some other direct costs such as materials and supplies that are required in the processing of these applications, and really those direct costs and follow the staff effort into the costing categories. Then moving over to the far left-hand side of the slide, we have indirect costs. So to really truly understand the full cost of providing a service, we want to take these into account as well. And what these are really the support functions and the overhead functions that exist, such as IT support, such as human resources, legal counsel, for example, or financial planning, that are more internal to the organization, but that ultimately enable those more outward-facing departments to provide the services that they do. So in terms of the process that was undertaken, initially we undertook a number of meetings with city staff to select appropriate costing categories. And really this is a critical step in the process because all of the subsequent process design, the effort estimation, and ultimately all of the costing that is undertaken is in light of these categories that are established. And also, going back to my comments from earlier, in order to achieve compliance with the Planning Act, it is a requirement to disaggregate it at this level. A total of 25 costing categories were established at the onset of the study. And initially, it was just a grouping by the application type that follows the tariff of fees that is imposed. But we went a little bit further than that and disaggregated certain applications by level of complexity, for example. And so when we think about official plan amendments or zoning bylaw amendments being separated into more of a standard process and a complex process, often defined by either the number of residential units that result from the application, or for non-residential applications, the amount of floor space that is being provided. So again, recognizing that there are fundamental differences in the amount of effort that is required to process these different application types. As well as some of these we disaggregated even further into more of a sub-process level, if you will. So when we are talking about the pre-application consultation process, that really isn't an application in itself, but it supports that application process. Because we felt that the city expends a considerable amount of effort and therefore cost to facilitate that pre-application consultation process, we wanted to really look at that in isolation from everything else as well, to understand the cost associated with that specifically. Once we had the costing categories established, the next step is to define or try to understand the processing effort that is required that goes into the processing of any of these applications. And so to do that, we developed very detailed process maps that define each of the steps that an application would go through as it goes from the application intake through the review process and ultimately approval or other recommendations. Those processing efforts or time estimates associated with them were developed by staff through internal business unit discussions. We then took those and sort of quality tested them by applying the historical average volumes of activity over the past 5 years to make sure that the overall level of effort that we're producing was reasonable. And so at that point, there were some refinements made to better align with the staff utilization levels that the city is currently experiencing, and some further refinements to recognize some ancillary processing efforts with respect to, for example, senior staff oversight throughout the entire review process, which are not maybe directly captured, but again, it's more indirect oversight time. In total then, based on this collection of effort estimates and in light of the volumes of application intake that the city has witnessed over the past 5 years, we see that the planning application process consumes approximately 23 staff in total on an annual basis across the organization. The vast majority of that staff effort comes from the planning group itself, with approximately 14.5 full-time equivalent positions being fully consumed by the processing of these planning applications, which represents approximately 72% of the staff complement in that group. And then the second largest group with involvement is the engineering group, which provides approximately 3.3 full-time equivalent positions to the processing of planning applications on an annual basis. As well, in addition to those, there are plenty of other departments that are involved at a more minor level, perhaps, in terms of the staff that requirements. Those departments include the building department, fire department, transportation services, clerks, legal support, and so on. So based on the processing effort requirements that were established, and then following the inclusion of direct and indirect costs, the full costs of processing these different applications were calculated and compared to the average annual revenues that are currently produced by the fees that the city is charging. The table that is shown on this slide is also found as table 3-2 on page 12 of the report, if you're looking for a little bit more clarity than what's provided on the slide. And what we see, page 32? Page 42 of the package, thank you. And so what we see from the table generally is that most of the city's current planning application fees are recovering less than what it's costing to provide those services, which is something that is not unusual when we go through these reviews. Further to that, there are some sub-processes that we talked about earlier for which the city is currently not recovering any costs at all, and most notably the pre-application consultation process, and we'll see some recommendations around that in a little bit. So overall, the city's current planning application fees are on average recovering approximately 45% of the annual costs of processing. So where it's costing the city on an annual basis just under $3 million to process planning applications, the city is currently recovering approximately $1.3 million from the fees that it imposes. So understanding then the full cost of these services, we were able to come up with what the full cost fees of these various application types would be, also taking into account some underlying application size characteristics. So again, recognizing that there are sort of fixed costs associated with reviewing an application regardless of the number of units that it ultimately results in, as well as some variable costs that vary with the complexity of the application. So that was all taken into account when we were looking at the full cost fees. But to not do that in isolation, we also wanted to make sure that we are looking more broadly at the market context and seeing what those fees are in other comparable municipalities. And so we undertook a market survey which included 9 comparator municipalities, including the city of Mississauga, Oakville, South Frontenac, Waterloo, the city of Belleville, and Guelph. A few words around the comparison tables that I would like to note. The full comparison survey is provided in Appendix A of our report. And really what the survey, I think, demonstrates is that there's a really wide variety of ways that municipalities charge for these different fees. The reason I'm noting that is it makes direct comparisons fairly difficult in many cases. Because certain categories in other municipalities might be rolled up with other categories. So again, that direct comparison becomes somewhat difficult. Furthermore, or as an example, there are some examples where the city maybe we're showing a fee for example, the pre-consultation process, where there may be blanks in the survey for other municipalities. That doesn't necessarily mean those municipalities do not charge for that activity. It more likely means that that activity is recovered through, or that cost is rolled into the application fee somewhere else. So just a few notes around the survey for that context. So once we had the municipal survey, we wanted to discuss the potential full cost recovery fees with city staff to come up with the recommendations that are ultimately being provided herein. So the recommendations that have been developed are meant to provide an improved cost recovery in targeted areas while still being reasonable and being comparable to those charged in other municipalities in Ontario. What we're also doing, however, is providing the city with a framework or roadmap, if you will, so that if the city wishes to pursue higher levels of cost recovery in the future, there's now a framework to provide that analysis in future years as well. So with the specific recommendations that are being made herein, and we'll go through each one in a second, in total, they would provide approximately 50% cost recovery on an annual basis compared to the current level of about 45% cost recovery. And so those recommendations specifically pertain to major zoning bylaw amendment applications, where the recommendation is to increase the planning aspect of that fee from approximately $10,500 today to $11,500 per application. That would see the level of cost recovery for that specific application type go from approximately 80% currently to approximately 85%. And when we look at what's generally charged in the market by other municipalities for this particular application type, we see that ranges from over $16,000 charged by the city of Ottawa to over $32,000 in the city of Mississauga. So again, we're keeping these fees well within the ranges that we see in the market. The next one would be to increase the planning component of fees for site plan modifications from, again, just over $1,500 currently to $2,000, to increase the request for security reductions to $500 from the current $396. And again, that would see the overall cost recovery level within that category go up from the current level of about 12% to about 15% under the fee recommendation. The next one would be to increase the planning component of the consent fee, the non-technical consent fee that is, to approximately $2,500 from a current level of $2,200, which is very similar to what the City of Ottawa is charging, at approximately $2,500 as well as the City of Mississauga. And again, within that category, we would see the level of cost recovery increase from about 27% currently to about 30% based on this recommendation. The second last bullet on the slide speaks about the pre-application consultation fee, which we mentioned a little bit earlier, which the city does not currently impose any fees for. And what we are recommending is for the city to impose a more nominal fee of about $300 for that application. And again, that's well within the range of fees that are charged by other municipalities, which range from $306 to about $510 in that regard. It is a activity that, as I mentioned, is not currently cost recovered at all and is costing the city over $300,000 to provide that service on an annual basis. And then finally, with respect to all the other fees, it's a nominal 3% increase that is being recommended to keep pace with inflationary pressures over the short term, and again, providing the city with a framework to reassess those fees further through future budget years as well. And so that concludes the formal part of the presentation. Here to take any questions that you may have with respect to the process or methodology, or with respect to the recommendations that are provided herein.
Thank you. And is there anything further that staff would like to say? No. I will open it up for members of the committee to speak to. Are there any comments or questions? Seeing none, could you take? Thank you. I guess my troubling concern, and I know that you can't just turn it on like a tap and suddenly be charging closer to, but I think the very good information that you've shared with us shows that taxpayers are subsidizing development fees by about half of what the true costs are or more. And I know that we need to remain competitive with other communities, but is there a possibility or a plan that we can more aggressively move towards a greater amount of cost recovery?
To you, Mr. Chair. I think the work that Watson has done has certainly established for us a very good understanding of the level of cost recovery. And for the 2019 year, obviously, we've recommended some minor changes to the entire fee structure. In future years, should council decide that they wanted to move towards a higher level of cost recovery, I think we certainly have the framework and the understanding that would enable us to implement more aggressive changes to that fee structure. And it's something we're certainly open to having that discussion in future years.
And to make it so, will you need direction from council, or will you just assume that and come back each year with a little bit greater than the 3% we usually apply?
I think the intent, sorry, through you, Mr. Chair, I think the intent for the 2020 fee review is that in 2019 we would do a more fulsome review and fulsome consultation with council and through planning committee to look at some increased fees in different areas to better cost recover.
Thank you. So, oh, and I'm sorry, my one other, just one other almost forgotten question. We all know that all developers aren't created equal, and I'm not going to name names, but there are some developers that are create much more demand on staff time than other developers. But we do a kind of general costing of things, don't we? So That's a frustration. So enough said. Thank you. So any further? Yes.
I return the chair, and I'm now going to ask my question through the chair. Thank you. I'm an outgoing councillor, but I'd just like to put in the record that I'd like to caution you in increasing this too aggressively, because I don't want to drive business out of town in terms of, putting up our costs too high so that it would be prohibitive for builders to want to build in our town. So I think just a cautionary note to be very careful how quickly you raise prices so it's not a sticker shock to people. So stay within inflationary boundaries, please. Thank you.
Although I think the report points to the fact that we're below what most municipalities are charging. Councillor Oosterhoff.
Yeah, I would echo Councillor Turner's comments. I think that we need to be careful with the comments that were made, because I think that we need to recognize that there's all kinds of different levels of developers, and that there's the common folk as well, that are out there that are trying to find their way and need to be given opportunities for success. And too much, I think we need to be welcoming. I need to be supportive. There's so much more that you could add on to this. It's also value for services. There's some real looking at that we need to do. So, I wouldn't want to give that too much weight to that comment, because that would cause me great concern as well. Thank you.
So we will agree. Any further questions, comments? Seeing none, thank you very much. We will now open it up to the public, if anybody wishes to make comments. And 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just have one point I would like to emphasize. And I missed the discussion I was talking about the last meeting, but with respect to complex applications that will need more staff time than those of, say, less complexity, and then projects being resubmitted back to staff based on changes from public input and that kind of thing. I can think of a few examples where this would be in play. How does staff calibrate the fees that are going to be charged in those cases, right? I mean, if, say, staff, maybe you have 2 planners working for a month, just as a scenario, to help a developer get their application ready for the planning committee the first time, and then you get 50 people coming up with ideas, and you say, okay, we're going to change this, 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 and this, and then you have to have planners go back and spend another 2 weeks on it. How do you calibrate what you're going to be charging in terms of the fees that those developers are paying in those cases? And again, I'm going to agree with Councillors Turner and Oosterhoff. I'm in favor of business. I'm in favor of development. Absolutely. But there have to be limits in terms of city losing money on cases like this where there's just more iterations that are going on and so forth. So I'm really curious as to what's going to happen with that. I need to thought about it and I'd like to hear what you're going to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions or comments from the public? Thank you.
Kathy Borowak, Habitat for Humanity, Kingston Limestone region. I just have one question about the comparison to other communities. Was there a cost recovery comparison done as well, rather than just the dollar values?
Thank you very much. Any further questions from the public? Seeing none, I will go back to the consultant and our staff.
Okay, thank you. So I'll address the questions in the order that they were posed. So the first one was asking about how the complexity of different applications is taken into account, and perhaps the number of resubmissions that happen as part of any particular application. So To again go back to the requirements of the Planning Act, which requires us to assess or cost justify these fees at the application type. It is an average cost approach. That's why we have gone a step further than that and disaggregated some of these application types into a more straightforward and a complex, for example, to start to get at the fact that certain applications with certain characteristics are more complex and require more effort. And so going beyond just the basic legislative requirements in that regard and providing the cost justification of the complex application separately. That being said, the city does have the ability, perhaps at some point in the future, to introduce fees for items such as resubmissions. So it's not unusual to see a municipality specify how many resubmissions are typically accepted as part of the application fee, and anything beyond that would be charged separately. And because we have done the costing exercise, understanding all of the process steps involved, we understand the sub-processes within that as well, right? So if we wanted to just consider what it costs the city to process another resubmission, we have that framework in place now to understand that as well. The second question around whether we, in the municipal comparison, looked at the cost recovery level of those municipalities, the answer would be no. So it is just comparing the quantum of the fee that those municipalities charge. Typically, the cost recovery levels are not something that is sort of in the public domain. We do have a bit of an understanding of that through the work that we as a firm do with municipalities, but within the context of the survey that's provided in the report, it does not look at the cost recovery levels.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
I'll go back to the committee. Any questions or comments? I look forward to the report coming forward. My question, I applaud when we do on complex files, when we require urban design peer reviews. Is that a supplemental fee that gets added so we don't lose the cost of those things, right?
To you, Mr. Chair, yes, that's a fee that's charged directly to the developer. So the developer would be in charge of paying the fee that the third-party consultant is charging for that peer review. So it doesn't cost anything to.
Thank you very much. I will now call this meeting closed, and we will go into our regular planning committee meeting. Thank you very much. First, I'll call the meeting to order and approval of the agenda. Thank you, Councillor Sanik. Thank you, Councillor Turner, who was the ghost hand going up. I didn't see your hand until I already mentioned her. So, confirmation of minutes. Oh, yes, I'll call the vote. All those in favor? Carried. Confirmation of minutes. Thank you. Councillor. Excellent. All those in favor? Carried. Disclosure of pecuniary interest. Seeing none. Delegations and briefings, we have none today. Business, I will read that out the statement. The portion of the meeting is open to the public. The city has initiated a new process in which members of the public will have an opportunity to speak for up to 5 minutes on comprehensive reports presented before the Planning Committee. Those wishing to provide oral comments at this meeting will be invited to do so. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision, I'm sorry, I've lost my line. Those wishing to provide oral comments at this meeting will be invited to do so. If a person or public body would otherwise have an ability to appeal the decision of the Council of Corporation of the City of Kingston to the local planning appeal tribunal, but the person or public body does not make oral submissions at a public meeting or make written submissions to the City of Kingston before the bylaw is passed, the person or public body is not entitled to appeal the decision. Our only business item tonight is 205 Resource Road. So I will open this up to the committee. Thank you, Councillor Turner.
We're going to do the public comments, then we'll do the moving and seconding. Sorry.
It's okay. Staff comments, sorry.
Thank you, through you. Just a brief summary, this is an application, it's a zoning amendment application proposing a 120 guest room hotel within the Cataraqui Industrial Estates Business Park. I just also wanted to point out that there has been a request to move this recommendation to the November 6th council meeting to allow foundations to be poured prior to the winter.
Thank you. I will now open it to the committee. Are there any questions or comments? I know we had a fulsome public meeting on this file. So I will open it up to the public. If you could make any comments that you haven't already made at the public meeting, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did follow the file earlier. I'm impressed with the design. I think it's very interesting spatial use of the property. Obviously, the proponents feel that there's demand for the business they're going to create there. So all the good things that we like to see from new development are going to come here if this gets approved. That's fantastic. And I guess my only points would be to retain the trees that are on the site insofar as possible, and to present a landscaping plan for how it's going to wind up being once it's all done, because you have some forested area to the north and the west. And I would be in favor of the file being bumped forward to get to the next meeting of council to expedite the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further members of the public wish to speak to this file? Seeing none, we'll go back to the committee. I don't believe there were any questions there for your response. Go ahead.
Thank you, through you. Just for clarification, currently processing an application for site plan control for the property, which does include a landscaping plan and has taken into consideration tree compensation and replanting on the site.
Thank you. We will now go back to the committee. A mover and a seconder to get it on the floor. Thank you, Councillor Turner, Councillor Sanik. Now might be the best time to move an amendment to bump it up to, for the reasons that were given. Councillor Sanik, Councillor Turner. All those in favor of the amendment? Carried. Thank you. Any further questions or comments regarding the recommendations before us? Seeing none, I'll call the question. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much. So I don't believe we have any motions or notices of motion. I'm just going to very briefly, under other business, ask a question if I might. So I will transfer the chair. I know that there are a couple of developments, one on, you've heard me ask this question before, one on University and one on Colburn, I believe, that are now 8 or 9 years in non-compliance, but are still being rented out. Are we any closer to resolving those two issues? Thank you.
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chair. With respect to University Avenue, that property has successfully been rezoned and is subject to site plan control at this point in time. So we are working with the applicant through some of the site plan improvements that were required on that property. The zoning that was approved by council did include many of the updates to the site that we require to be seen through site plan control. So if we do end up in a situation where we don't see proactive movement on that site plan, we're able to go back and do active zoning enforcement on the property with respect to that one for university. With respect to...
And you anticipate that in the near future occurring?
Yes, yes,
Good.
we do.
Thank you.
With respect to Colburn Street, that report, we've been working with the applicant to finalize the details around some of the architectural changes that may be required to the structure. That report will be on the December 6th Planning Committee meeting with a comprehensive report and recommendation.
Thank you very much. I want to stop nagging you people about that, so I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you very much. Correspondence. We received one piece of correspondence regarding secondary suites. And no comments on correspondence. Date and time of the next meeting is November 15th at 6:30. Oh, a different address. Portsmouth Olympic Harbor, Press Lounge.
Where we've had it the last couple of years when we've been outside.
Yeah, so we shall be there. Jog my memory, or I'll be here. Thank you very much. So, motion to adjourn. Everybody lifts their hands. Seconder. All those in favor? Carried. Thank you very much.